Hi, I'm Becca. I'm part of the Baltic Crew team and I'm here today to talk about Middle of Somewhere by Joanne Coates. So you might have seen work by Joanne before at Baltic. She had the Lightbox commission on our ground floor just near the desk in 2022. And then Middle of Somewhere is a new commission as part of the Vassar Baltic Artists Award. So Joanne is a visual artist. She's also a farm labourer and is based in a rural area of the northeast of England. So Joanne's work kind of focuses on issues around climate, rural living, class and gender. And a lot of it is informed by her own lived experience, growing up as a young working class woman in a rural area, kind of having to leave at age 16 and then the gradual journey to returning. For this exhibition, Joanne has combined photography, film, installation and sound to kind of really hone in on issues specifically affecting young working class women in these areas and to kind of really think about the impacts of climate change on their lives and to kind of challenge sort of stereotypes and preconceptions that we might have about rural life. So just as a quick bit of history, in the 1960s and 70s across the UK there was the second rural revolution, which isn't often talked about that much. So basically during that time what happened is sort of rural countryside areas were gradually transformed into tourist spots, and what started to happen was second homes and holiday lets were really starting to spring up. So often when we think about rural living, we tend to think of these really sort of peaceful, idyllic, picturesque landscapes that are sort of escapes, quite often for kind of middle-class holiday makers from their day-to-day lives. But actually what's happened to a lot of working class communities who are residents in these areas is increasingly they're struggling to afford sort of safe housing. A lot of young people especially are being kind of priced out of the areas they've grown up in and are being forced to make the decision to move away. And increasingly people are kind of really struggling with the impacts of climate change as well. So for this work, Joanne has worked across two different locations. So Orkney in Scotland, where she's kind of worked for a number of years, and the Yorkshire Dales in England, which is kind of the area she's grown up in. It's kind of where she's based now as well. It was really important to Joanne that she was working in areas that she has these kind of really close personal lived connections to, as opposed to kind of like parachuting into places kind of as like a passive observer. And also by kind of choosing locations that are 500 miles apart from each other, she's really highlighting the fact that these issues aren't just unique to one area, it is something that's kind of happening across the country as well. Within her work, Joanne is kind of guided by 6 core principles. So that is partnership, consent, sustainability, freedom, choice, and sensitivity. So she's really, when she's making her work, she's really thinking about it as a collaboration. She's thinking about whose voice is being heard, who's being platformed, who is this for. And when you look at the photos in this space, there is this real duality to them because they are very sort of beautiful, kind of visually pleasing images, and they do really highlight the natural beauty of these areas. But when you kind of look closely at these pictures and really inspect them, you kind of start to see these other layers coming out. So like building structures that are falling apart, you start to see evidence of flooding and erosion, for example. So she's really highlighting these things that quite often we don't talk about when we're talking about rural living. And she's also worked really closely with some of the women in these communities as well. So for example, here we have Aisling. So this photo was taken after quite a lot of meetups and conversations between Joanne and Aisling. And it's taken in Hoy, in an area that's quite close to Aisling's childhood home. So it's where she would come and play with her sisters when they were kids. And she had to make the really difficult decision to kind of move away from this area and move into mainland Orkney, because although it's a place she has this really sort of close, fond connection to, she was really struggling with the impacts of kind of rural isolation and lack of social connection. We've kind of got a similar story over here with Anita. Joanne met Anita during her work in the Yorkshire Dales. Anita kind of grew up in social housing and she struggled with housing for a number of years as well in her adult life. And again, she kind of had to make a similar decision where she had to move away from the area where all her family are based. She kind of had to retrain, she had to relocate her business and move to an area kind of with more opportunities where she could afford to live. So again, it's really by telling the stories of these individuals and having their voices heard. Joanne's really kind of highlighting the real individual impact of this rural gentrification, and again how kind of people are being priced out of these areas that they've once called home. So then we have this structure here. So this has kind of been inspired by like rural bus shelters, and it's been made using sort of found wood that's been reused, and she's sort of built it in collaboration with a builder that she met in one of the areas she's worked in. So again, really sort of leaning into that sort of consideration of sustainability. It's kind of, it's partly referencing kind of the fact that in a lot of rural areas there's a real lack of public transport, and that does cause a lot of issues for people. But it's also quite a nice nod to these sort of these public resources that quite often kind of get taken over by their communities. So whether that's like a bus stop that gets turned into an art gallery, or a phone box that gets converted into a library and so on. And it's kind of this space where you can come in, it's this safe, comfortable environment to kind of sit and just take everything in while you're in the space. It's lined with this wallpaper that kind of illustrates sort of women's labour that quite often goes unseen in these rural areas. So you've got farmers, you've got hospitality workers, you've got cleaners. Quite often these are women on really sort of precarious 0 hours contracts. She's making visible the work that goes on behind the scenes that quite often isn't seen by holiday makers coming into these areas. But these women in these communities are so crucial to kind of making these landscapes what they are and maintaining them and shaping them. You've also then got the postcards in the space. So these have come about through workshops that Joanne has run in sort of grassroots community hubs in the areas that she's worked in. And they kind of document like the hopes, the dreams, sort of the fears and the memories of women in these places kind of in their own words. And the idea is they're going to be swapped out every 3 weeks. So over the course of the exhibition's run, you will be hearing a lot of different women's voices from these areas. We've then got the film, which is kind of combined with a sound piece. So in it, you can kind of hear the voices of women that Joanne's worked with, a lot of the ones that are kind of represented within this space. And they're kind of snippets from interviews and voice notes, sort of from conversations they've been having. It's then kind of combined with camcorder footage and archival footage, some of it sort of taken by Joanne. And a lot of what is talked about and represented visually in that video is kind of people worrying about the impact of climate change on their areas, kind of how flooding in these areas because of climate change is making it so that safe, affordable housing to rent is becoming less and less available, and kind of the anxieties that come around potential existential threat to these areas and a potential future where possibly only rich people are going to be able to afford to live in these areas. And then it's combined with birdsong as well that Joanne has kind of collected from across the Yorkshire Dales and Orkney. She's kind of drawing this parallel between people in these areas, you know, human people who've kind of had to move away and sort of change their behaviour based on what's happening, and similarly, a lot of birds have had to sort of change their migration patterns because of ecological disaster. So she's kind of drawing this parallel between human lives and non-human lives as well. So again, it's not just focusing on human voices. So we've then also got this snippet of a poem here from John Clare. So John Clare was a farm worker and a poet. He was a really prolific poet in the UK, but unfortunately he also had quite a lot of difficulty in his life, and he did sort of live and die in poverty. And this comes from a poem that kind of references the sort of the conflict in emotions in kind of having to leave your rural home or making that decision, and then kind of returning but never quite feeling a sense of belonging or home, and kind of the struggles that come with that. And the last thing I'll just kind of touch on is the font choice and the colour in the space, because we do get quite a lot of questions about that. So there's a few different reasons for these aesthetic choices. A big part of it is in this space, Joanne has made a conscious decision that it's kind of deliberately vague where we might be situated in time. So on the one hand, the colour and the font could look very contemporary. They could look like a lot of stuff that's being made today. So we could be sort of situated in the modern era. Equally, there's kind of a nod to sort of 1970s and 1980s aesthetics, so potentially we could also be situated somewhere in the past as well. And I suppose that links quite nicely to the idea that, you know, a lot of what's happening in the present is really informed by the past, by this history of gentrification. You know, nothing really exists in a vacuum. But equally, it's continuing to inform the future, and it's kind of making us think about the fact that we do have agency in that, and, you know, kind of think about what we can do to shape our future in a positive way. She also says that the pink is kind of a bit of a nod to the gender inequality that she talks about. So typically pink is kind of a colour that we've come to associate with femininity, and again, so having that in a space where she is talking about the fact that women's voices are often going unheard or being made invisible, I guess it's just a way of making that sort of that presence of the feminine voice in these areas visible. So as you can see, there's quite a lot of different layers to unpack with this exhibition. I would really just encourage everyone who's able to come in, spend some time with the photos, take a seat in the bus shelter, take it all in, and feel free to come and talk to us with any questions or if you want to talk about it more.